Welcome to the deep dive. You contacted us with this real fascination with the Dead Sea area, and it's understandable. It's a place where you've got these incredible natural forces at play, but also, the impact of human industry and its really, really deep historical and spiritual significance. So we thought for this deep dive, we'd pull together all sorts of stuff, your initial thoughts, some historical accounts, details about, the industries operating there, and even some of the biblical context to try to give you, a clearer picture of what's going on in this really unique place.
Absolutely. We want to connect all these dots for you. It's like we're building a puzzle, right? And each of these sources is a different piece. Geology stretching back millions of years, the modern challenges the region faces, all fascinating stuff.
I think a good place to start might be with those sinkholes that have been appearing around the Dead Sea. It's not ancient history either. Our sources suggest they've really become a problem in, the last 20, 25 years, relatively recently.
Yeah, and what's really interesting is understanding why. Like at the ground level, so you have fresh water, right? From rain, underground springs, all sitting on top of this much denser, super salty water, the Dead Sea. And as that fresh water seeps down, well, it hits these huge underground deposits of salt. I mean, we're talking, in some places, 60, 70, even 80% of what's under the surface is salt.
So then that fresh water
Yeah,
dissolves the salt layers, right?
exactly. And over time, that creates these empty spaces underground,
No.
cavities, and they just can't support the weight above anymore. Like the foundations are literally being eaten away. Eventually, boom, the surface collapses and you get a sinkhole.
So, I mean, it makes sense then that they'd pop up more in places where the ground was like saturated with groundwater, especially near where the shoreline used to be. One thing I found really interesting in the sources was that they actually had to reroute a major road because of these sinkholes, a detour of, 50 kilometers, because the sinkholes were forming right under the original route. They even put in extra concrete to reinforce the new road. But, it sounds like it's still super vulnerable to flash floods.
Oh, absolutely. It really highlights how unstable the ground is in certain areas, and it can be really dangerous. I mean, one of the sources even mentions this geologist, Dr. Lurais, who fell into a sinkhole and was stuck there for 16 hours.
16 hours.
Right.
Wow. Yeah, that puts the danger in perspective. And it's all tied to the fact that the Dead Sea itself has been shrinking, receding pretty dramatically over the last, 30 to 40 years, the sources say. And of course, that has a huge impact on tourism. I mean, Mineral Beach, for example, it's not so accessible anymore because the water's just so far away.
Right. And the root of that is that more water is being taken from the Jordan River and its tributaries, for various uses. Plus, you've got those periods of lower rainfall. It's a simple equation. Less water flowing in, way more evaporating out. So yeah, tourists are heading further north to beaches like Kalia, Neve Zohar, Bianchini.
And each one of those northern beaches has its own kind of trade-offs for visitors, right? Like Kalia is popular, but the walk to the actual water's edge can be pretty long.
Yeah.
Then you have Bianchini and Neve Zohar, which even have swimming pools as an option. Which, let's be honest, the Dead Sea, it's more of a quick float and a photo op, especially if you've got any cuts.
Right, right. And, it's really interesting when you consider the industries that are operating there alongside these environmental changes. Like one of your sources even mentioned the term greenwashing in the context of the Dead Sea museums, which, I mean, it raises the question, how do you reconcile the narrative of, industrial progress with what's visibly happening to the environment?
Exactly. And, the main player there is the Dead Sea Works. They're extracting these valuable minerals, potash, bromide, magnesium, and they're even, as the sources explain, dredging salt from the bottom of the Dead Sea to make more space for the extraction, which, it definitely benefits Israel economically and, of course, the shareholders. But it's hard to deny that it's contributing to that water level decline.
Yeah, the numbers are pretty clear. The water level's dropping by just over a meter every year. When you think about it like that, I mean, it's understandable why people are seriously worried about the long-term future of the Dead Sea.
And, despite some pretty ambitious projects being proposed like the Dead Sea Conveyance right now, it seems like the focus is more on stabilizing the water level where it is, not really reversing that decline.
Now, maybe it's a good time to take a step back, way, way back, millions of years back, to the geological history that created all of this. Because the Dead Sea we see today, well, it's the result of this long, multi-stage geological process.
Right, and our sources outline four main stages. Initially, you had a connection to the Mediterranean Sea or the ancient Tethys Sea, I think it was called,
Yeah.
and that formed this southern lagoon.
Right. Then in the second stage, you had this volcanic activity in the Golan Heights region, and that actually blocked that connection to the Mediterranean. So this lagoon, it became a huge inland lake. They call it Lake Gomorrah, and it was massive. I mean, it stretched from the Hula Valley all the way down to the northern Alaba region. And with no outlet to the ocean, the intense evaporation led to these massive salt deposits building up over time.
And then you have the third stage, where Lake Moura starts to shrink, right?
Yeah.
And it eventually separates from what would later become the Sea of Galilee.
Exactly. And finally, about 20,000 years ago, you have the fourth stage, which gives us the Dead Sea as we know it today. But what's really fascinating is how these different geological periods and all the different climates over time, they created these distinct layers of sediment and the incredible mineral deposits we find in the region today.
Yeah, it's amazing to think about these massive forces at work over such vast periods. I mean, even Mount Sedum, the sources mentioned that it's essentially a huge block of salt that's being pushed upwards at a rate of like 5 to 9 millimeters per year,
Yeah.
just because of the pressure from the rocks above it.
Yes.
And that upward movement is what created those salt caves in the area.
Absolutely fascinating, right? And speaking of those minerals, let's talk about the economic importance of the Dead Sea today. Primarily, that comes from the Dead Sea Works and their extraction of potash, bromide, and magnesium.
And it's so easy to forget how much those minerals are a part of our daily lives.
Yeah.
One of the sources had this quiz that was really eye-opening. Would you have guessed that components from the Dead Sea are in laptops, in the fertilizers for our fruit, in the magnesium in our tires? They even contribute to the turf of the Euro Cup through potash. And they're in our mobile phones as flame retardants. It's kind of amazing.
It really is. And the story behind this industrial activity is pretty interesting, too. There was this guy, Moshe Novomesky, they call him Grandpa Novomesky, and he was this Siberian mining engineer with a vision. He wanted to transform this seemingly barren land into something productive by extracting these minerals. And he was the one who really pushed for the founding of the Potash Company, which later became the Dead Sea Works.
And his approach was pretty ingenious, right? He used these massive evaporation ponds to naturally separate the different salts based on how soluble they are. And then from there, they extract the valuable minerals. The sources explained how the P9 pumping station plays a key role, too, in moving water from the deeper northern basin to the shallower southern basin, the evaporation pool. So there's a constant supply for both mineral production and for Pool 5 at the hotels.
Yeah, the scale of the operation is pretty impressive. They harvest something like 20 million tons of carnallite every year. That's the crystal with the potash and magnesium from those evaporation ponds, and that gives them about 4 million tons of potash. And, they use mainly solar energy for the evaporation, which is pretty cool.
They've even got this 80-kilometer-long conveyor belt to transport the potash to the processing plant.
Mm-hmm.
It seems way more efficient and environmentally friendly than a constant stream of trucks.
Yeah.
And I thought it was interesting that they actually return over 2/3 of the water they pump to the Dead Sea after the minerals are extracted.
Right, but even with all that, the Dead Sea Works still has an impact on the water level. The sources estimate that maybe 25 centimeters of that yearly drop is because of their operations. But you also have to acknowledge the economic benefits the Dead Sea Works and the tourist industry bring to the region, jobs, income. And they're really capitalizing on these unique places like Pool 5.
Now, we can't talk about the Dead Sea without touching on the historical and biblical context, right? I mean, this area has so much significance. The sources mention figures like King David and Jesus or Yeshua, who were said to have spent time in the region. There were the Essenes at Qumran, of course, and the story of Masada. So much history.
And even way back then, people recognized how unique the Dead Sea was. There's actually a Byzantine-era map that shows, ships in distress and fish dying as they get close to the water because of the extreme saltiness.
And, of course, there's the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, which is so closely tied to the Dead Sea. Some people even think Sodom was located where Mount Sedum is today, that huge salt mountain we talked about.
And then you have that pillar of salt, Lot's wife, right? It's a natural formation, but it's directly connected to the biblical account in Genesis and even mentioned in the Quran. Really fascinating stuff.
And, the sources tell the story of Abraham negotiating with God to spare Sodom and Gomorrah if there were enough righteous people living there. And some interpretations, like the one by Rashi, say that Abraham actually stopping the negotiation might have led to the cities being destroyed. It's pretty thought-provoking.
Right, and then you have the stories of Lot and his daughters, which tie into the origins of the Ammonites and the Moabites. And the sources point out that a lot of these biblical stories, they weren't just moral lessons, they were also used to like define relationships and create these hierarchies between different groups in the region.
Mm.
The Edomites, for example.
And we can't forget the War of the Four and Five Kings, which took place in the Dead Sea area during Abraham's time, according to the sources. And it's really interesting to think about how there have been these three major periods of Jewish return to the region.
Hmm.
The Exodus from Egypt, the return from Babylon, and then the modern Zionist movement, all connected to the promise of the land to Abraham. And each time they encounter these existing populations.
Absolutely. It's also worth noting that asphalt from the Dead Sea was used for embalming in ancient Egypt,
Mm.
really highlights how valuable the resources from this region have been throughout history. And even with all those connections, the sources acknowledge that the exact location of Sodom and Gomorrah is still debated. Nobody's 100% sure.
Now, shifting gears a bit to the modern landscape, the sources describe this agricultural area, Moshav Neot Hakikar, near the Jordan River. And it sounds like a really sensitive area because it's right on the border.
Yeah, it is. And get this, they built a dam in the area and it actually changed the course of the water, which then shifted the border with Jordan. The farmers there use a mix of brackish and desalinated water to grow their crops, date palms mainly, which are interesting because they use a lot of water, especially in a desert environment.
The sources mention some of the labor challenges they're facing, too. A lot of Thai workers have left the area, it sounds like. But on the other hand, there are these agricultural research facilities there, so they're definitely trying to innovate and adapt.
It's pretty amazing, the wildlife that manages to thrive in this harsh environment, you know? You've got wild boars, jackals, foxes, even a unique fish called the Vita Vita malacon that lives in the brackish springs,
Yeah.
adapted to that specific environment.
There's also that tragic story about the military base dining room collapsing in the 1970s
Yeah.
because of the unstable sediments. And now there's a memorial there, a pretty stark reminder of the geological realities of the region.
Yeah, it is. And the sources really emphasize the role of tour guides in all of this, connecting the biblical stories with the actual landscape that visitors see and putting the modern realities of the Dead Sea into context. It's a complex picture for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. So, as we wrap up this deep dive, I think it's clear that the Dead Sea region, it's just layers upon layers of complexity. You've got these massive geological forces that have shaped the landscape over millions of years. The human effort to extract resources, the environmental challenges that come with that, and this deep historical and spiritual significance that goes back centuries. It's all interconnected.
It really is. It's like all these pieces of information come together to paint a picture of a region that's constantly changing, both naturally and because of human activity. It's fascinating to think about.
Absolutely. So as a final thought for you, given all this, the economic needs, the environmental concerns, the historical narratives, what do you think the future holds for the Dead Sea? What direction should things go in? It's a big question.
Yeah.
But we encourage you to go back to the sources we've talked about, explore the different perspectives, and, keep learning. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
It was a pleasure.
We'll see you next time.